Of the opposition.
Speaker, Labor will be supporting the second reading of this legislation, but in a moment I want to come to the concerns that both Labor and the Green Party had about the way in which this bill was introduced and then considered in the Select Committee. What we know about security intelligence is that it's inherently controversial. It does involve the intrusion into the privacy of individuals, and therefore it does involve the question of human rights. Those issues, however, need to be weighed against issues of national security, and in today's world that means obviously international terrorism and the need to safeguard against that. It also means breaches of cybersecurity. This is becoming a bigger thing in the world and threatens the commercial interests of New Zealand. It's real, it's happening. We need a security intelligence service and relevant legislation in order to protect ourselves against that. It involves issues such as drugs, arms and people trafficking. It involves nuclear proliferation and a range of threats to our national security and the well-being of our personnel, police and defence forces deployed overseas. So security intelligence is a critical part of the protection against those threats. What this bill does, in essence, is take an original act that's now 42 years old, updates it and explicitly authorises modern technological methods of surveillance. The original act came in an era where nobody had heard of electronic communications such as cell phones, laptop computers, the internet and social networks. It explicitly provides for the SIS to undertake tracking of subjects by electronic means. It confirms that facilities such as cell phone numbers and IP addresses can be the subject of warrant applications. It allows under warrant access into computer systems, and it provides protection from liability to those persons exercising SIS entry powers when they're seeking to obtain or facilitate entry. It provides for delegation of responsibilities where that is necessary to improve efficiency and to enable the SIS to react more quickly during operations. In Labor's view, each of those changes are justifiable in making explicit or updating mechanisms used by the SIS. It really updates the powers rather than extends the existing powers. But naturally, this was an area that was going to be very controversial publicly. And that's why, first of all, I believe that it was both unnecessary and stupid of the government to introduce this legislation under urgency. That simply created suspicion that this was a government that had something to hide. On top of that, we then had a situation where submissions made to the Select Committee looking at this were deemed necessary to be held behind closed doors. Both I and Russell Norman from the Green Party opposed the hearing of submissions in secrecy. There was no reason for that. The public should be able, on any piece of legislation, to have their voice heard in an arena where the media and the public are there to observe and to follow what is happening. There was nothing that I heard through the entire process of submissions that needed to be held in secret, Mr. Speaker. They could have been held in public. That sort of transparency and openness would have encouraged the public to look on this legislation as something that the government was being quite upfront about and was a necessary piece of legislation. Instead, the way in which it was handled led people to suspect the worst of what the government was trying to do, Mr. Speaker. I regret that the government made those decisions in the way that they did. Well, the process was marred in that way, Mr. Speaker. In another sense, having heard the submissions, and particularly with the proposals put forward by the Labor Party and the Green Party, I think we made some worthwhile changes to this bill that improves the nature of the bill. I'd like to acknowledge in particular three sets of submissions, one made by the Human Rights Commission. I thought it was a very appropriate submission, and led us to include in the bill a section that sets out the rights that should be observed by the Security Intelligence Service. Likewise, I acknowledge the thoughtful contributions made by Hazel Armstrong and also by the Council of Trade Unions. While at least two of those bodies opposed the legislation, they put forward their ideas in a very constructive and thoughtful manner, and I thought was very helpful to the bill that we have ended up with. We've put in a section in the bill that includes reference to human rights, democratic oversight, and the impartiality and the professionalism that is expected of the Security Intelligence Service. That is the first time we have those principles enshrined in the legislation, and I believe that it strengthens the legislation. A further safeguard was added to help prevent people becoming subject to surveillance because of mistaken identity. That was a real risk, and the provision that we added to the bill will help prevent that. Another requirement was added that non-relevant records obtained by electronic tracking must be destroyed as soon as practicable after the expiry of the intelligence warrant. The final safeguard that I think was necessary, given the move to delegate power from the Director-General to people that are named subsequent to the warrant being issued, is that there will be periodic reporting of those delegations to the Inspector-General of Intelligence and Security. I think that's important in terms of the Inspector-General and the functions that he carries out in that regard. In support of the bill, Mr. Speaker, I note that the Ministry of Justice evaluated it, and in terms of its consistency with the Human Rights Act and the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, it found that the legislation was consistent with the rights and the protections enshrined in that legislation. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, the bill received consideration by the Law Commission, by its Deputy President, Dr. Warren Young, who's a person that I think is widely respected across the House. And Dr. Young noted, and if I can quote this from him, "While there are some impacts on privacy, this is clearly justified by the associated benefits. In particular, updating the warrant framework is a recognition of technological changes in the storage of and communication of information, and is essential in order to enable the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service to continue to effectively undertake its statutory functions." Last but not least, Mr. Speaker, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner didn't oppose the bill and noted that the warrant proposals represent an extension, quote unquote, in application of existing powers rather than an extension, quote unquote, in principle of existing powers. Mr. Speaker, I think this legislation is appropriate to the needs of New Zealand at this time. It is essentially a modernisation of the legislation. It respects the balance that needs to be found between privacy and respect for human rights, with the necessity for national intelligence to protect New Zealand against international threats. Mr. Speaker, on that basis, Labor supports the second reading of this bill.
Paseta Sam Luduinga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr.